was posted as ambassador overseas for more than 10 years. And my last posting was in Egypt. They have requested me an extension and I agreed. And they wanted me to still carry on. I said I'm a stranger in Singapore. It's time for me to go home. So that's why I came back in the 2007. Then I got a call from former President of Singapore, Mr. S.R. Nathan, inviting me and my wife for lunch at the Istana. So I thought that the President may be making a tour to Egypt and he may want me to brief him on Egypt. Throughout the lunch, there was no mention of Egypt. At the end of the lunch, the President told me, Tua Ba, you cannot come back to Singapore doing nothing. You must help me. I didn't realize at that time he was the patron of the Singapore Red Cross. And that's how I was drawn in. After that, the then chairman of Red Cross, Mr. Winston Chu, contacted me. And that's how it started. I told Mr. I find it hard to decline the President's offer. It is something that you can do to help the less fortunate, the vulnerable. And coming from the President, I find it hard to decline. I therefore say that, look, I don't want to be chairman immediately. Give me a year to find out what Red Cross is about. And whether I would be able to contribute a comfortable bit or the organization is comfortable with me. It was only 1 year later on that I became chairman, after I decided that, look, this is an area where I could do something about it. Okay? So it's now more than 11 years now. Well, most Singaporeans know about Red Cross, especially our mission in helping victims of disaster. One of the biggest disasters that hit Singapore was in 2004. The disaster which hit a great part of Asia, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Maldives, even Thailand and so on. And this was such a massive disaster that in certain part of Indonesia, Sumatra, almost few 100,000 people were wiped off. Singapore was very generous. Our people were doing well, and the donation amounting to $89 million were raised for the first time in the history of Singapore. I came in slightly later on, after the disaster, when rehabilitation, redevelopment started. And that was how I was directly involved with the first and biggest major disaster. I had the opportunity to visit Indonesia, and I could see it was terrible because whole villages were wiped out. Part of Sumatra was very flat, and I could even see ships on the roof of houses, which was quite a long distance from the sea and so on. I think that was the first major one which we were involved directly, and this ultimately resulted in almost 70 projects. I mean, we have raised so much money, and for Red Cross to carry out all the project by itself may not have the manpower And therefore we work together with all the other charity, especially from the religious groups, with their contact there. And ultimately, we all carry out in response to the whole rehabilitation, rebuilding under the Singapore flag. The fund was known as the Tidal Wave Fund. Okay, and from henceforth, I do not know whether it's a change in the climate in the world. The number of disasters that followed were tremendous. You have hitting China, earthquake. You have Myanmar, the cyclone Nargis, where whole fishing village were wiped out. Then you have Japan, which was involved when the Hokkaido region in the northeast of Japan was 3 prefectures were badly affected by the tsunami, and so on until recently, Nepal, and the various countries, Cambodia and Burma. And if you look at it, Southeast Asia and Asia in our region is now the most disastrous prone area in the whole world. We are fortunate. Singaporeans are doing well, and Singaporeans have their hearts in the right places. They contributed generously whenever a disaster came into existence. And I think that and the other important thing is, because Singapore don't have disaster, we could utilize our Red Cross personnel to help. Disaster in the region, disaster in our neighborhood, and so on. Okay. And we have been very successful working with our related charity group in Singapore. I think they know what is expected of us, especially on the question of integrity in managing fund. Having experienced all these major disasters, I realized that the most important phase is the emergency response phase. When a disaster strikes, you have 3 phases. One is the first emergency response phase, where you have to send emergency relief supply, water, medicine, and so on. Right? The second is rehabilitation, recovery, and rebuilding, and that will take a longer time for building project. I think that part, the second and third phase, we have no problem. We have great experience in dealing with it, and we are also very open. We will make sure that money are properly spent before we more or less, accept payment out to all the related charities. But I find that whenever an emergency strike hit a country, we could not move, because we will have to raise money from the public before we can start to prepare for the emergency phase, water, medicine, and so on. Right? And I think it is very odd, and you need to respond within 24 to 48 hours. If it's going to take longer than that, the emergency phase is totally irrelevant. So ultimately, together with the support of my council member, I push that we must set up an emergency response fund and convince him that, look, when an emergency strikes, you must respond 24 to 48 hours. And it could also happen to Singapore. And we need that fund. And we told them that, look, we have some remnants of funds from fund of the tidal wave, we should use it as the emergency response fund, so that whenever a disaster strikes, we could move very rapidly to help victims, especially in medicine, water, and so on. Okay, so it was agreed, and it was because of this Singapore Red Cross was able to respond very rapidly to any disaster. So with the fund, our international department is able to get more volunteers, train them to respond to disaster in areas, and we set up a whole new department, training and getting them knowing the terrain, how do they respond to the situation, and so on. And I think I'm very glad that we have, to a great extent, expedited the whole process of responding. I think among all the organizations, we are about always now the first one to be able to move. As I said, most of the people of Singapore know about our response to disaster, but they are not aware that we also have our own local community and charity. And the other thing I want to emphasize is Singapore Red Cross is not an NGO like many of our charities here. In fact, Singapore Red Cross is prescribed by an Act of Parliament. And we are almost, and the President of Singapore is the patron of Singapore Red Cross. It's important. In the emergency, we are able to respond very rapidly. And I think that improved our response to disaster in the region. The Singapore Constitution is outdated. It is like a dinosaur. It's massive. It comprises more than 30 over members of the council. And it makes decision making very difficult and slow. The function of the board with operation and management, which in reality, in accordance with modern organization, the board should play its most important role as an oversight, looking after the management and operation. Unless we change it, we are going to be impeded in our progress. And their function will be oversight over finance, over corporate governance, and also selection and nomination for council member. I think that's important to follow. And we incorporate declaration of conflict of interest, so that if you are involved in certain project and there's a tender, you have to declare and you should not vote. In fact, it was from my experience in running a big organization and also my knowledge of a listed company, I realized that we have to upgrade. And we need to appoint people to the board with relevant experience so that they are able to give advice and exercise effective oversight. It's important from the corporate governance point of view, and we also brought in whistleblowing. There's always the danger that if you run a big organization in some remote corner where you do not have oversight, some hanky-panky may go on. And if assuming we allow bona fide whistleblower, I think this will be quite a deterrent to ensure that everything is done properly. And I think that turns out to be very effective. With this, we also call for transparency. I was the advocate that whatever we do we must do it openly. It should be out in the internet. Everything should be, everything should be done in an open manner. And I think this set the tone to our first award of corporate governance when it was introduced, and followed subsequently by transparency. And I'm very glad that we brought about the change, which brought about a more effective organization. And I think this is an area which will help us to further develop Singapore Red Cross. Okay. It has always been my belief when I've joined the Red Cross that volunteers, in fact, are the backbone of Singapore Red Cross. And while we may have regular paid staff, ultimately, we must ensure that the Red Cross volunteers are given function, reflect their role as the backbone of the Singapore Red Cross. And on paper, we may have 5,000 volunteers, but because 5,000 is written in paper but not engaged, ultimately the number that is effective for this volunteer is so much less than what we claim to be. As a volunteer organization, we cannot keep on recruiting more and more paid staff, though they are an important component of Singapore Red Cross. Therefore, we must set up a merit assessment system, volunteer force. We also must be able to develop leadership within the volunteers so that they are able to run on their own. I think this is an objective and mission which I have set, and I push for this Red Cross Award by President. And I think that was something which I think we ultimately achieved. And I think this brought up the morale of all the volunteers. And I told them, be generous. They are working with us for no pay, and what we are giving is recognition of their contribution. And the next phase is to talent and develop leadership from among them. And I would be most happy they are able to run on their own, with perhaps guidance from the regular. I would say that every paid executive should be a coordinated link between the volunteer and the regular Red Cross. And if we can achieve that effective and we empower them down the ground, Singapore Red Cross is 5,000 stronger. And one of the most dangerous things that could infect a long-standing organization is what I call the frog syndrome. You put the frog into a big kettle of water, you put boiling water, and you increase the temperature, the frog will keep on adapting while the environment is slowly changing. Before you can realize it, the frog is burnt alive. So a lot of the function of Red Cross, quite a number is taken over by civil defense. And yet you're still carrying on the same thing. When I first joined Red Cross, they did not even have a strategic plan. Keep on doing the same thing all over and over again. First aid. And running an organization is more than just maintaining the routine. And if you carry that way, we will be totally irrelevant. We review all our local services. And we need to reinvent ourselves with a new environment As I mentioned, some of our functions have been taken over by civil defense. If you look at it, in early days, even Red Cross has to set up a medical clinic. Those were okay in the days when we are poor. But now with so many clinics and government, it becomes irrelevant. Things will change over the time. And so many of our services. That's why we went into review of services. We have first aid on wheel. Yet, there are people who fall in between the cracks. And this is where we have decided that we could provide aid. And then the other thing facing us is we are facing an increasingly very serious aged problem. By 2030, 1 in 4 will be 65 and above. And many of these aged will be living alone. And this will take us a long time because 1 in 4 is very serious. Means less young men for the workforce, less young men for the Red Cross. And this is a growing problem. And many of these aged, quite a vast proportion, may not be so well off. And I don't think we want to see a situation where all these aged, whether still handicapped, some may be suffering illnesses, some may have financial problem, and we don't want to see them dying alone without anybody knowing it, as it happened in the West. I've been telling our own Red Cross that in view of this, don't totally depend on the young to join the Red Cross. So many of these young are in the process of establishing their career. No, you cannot have the same number which you wanted before. You got to make use of some of these aged who are professional and who are healthy. And that's brought about the whole series of health aid, transport aid. And we are now directly relevant in providing a service to the community. I think that's important. In 2008, I was exposed to major disaster in the region, and I see how people suffer. Their homes were wiped out, they don't have food, proper sanitation, and so on. And also looking at our own people who fall in between the cracks. It is something where you feel that you have a duty to help, and I think that's important. And that's why, in the sense that I make my message clear that whenever a disaster which we have help is over, we must send our young Red Cross to the areas after it's safer, so that they could interact with those who have suffered. And I think this is important because living life in Singapore is a piece of cake. And they must be exposed to see how other people live. And I think they will have made better citizens and more filial members of the community. I think that's important. They have lived too good a life, and once they're exposed, they become a better individual in the interest. Okay. And if you are going to endure as a trusted organization, we must deal with the donation we have with integrity. That's why I will not tolerate any breach of honesty because we raise millions of dollars. And these are hard-earned public money. I was quite moved. People who are not so well off now are prepared to give their CPF money as a heritage to give it to Red Cross. There was even a young lady who gave part of her HDB share of the property to Red Cross. And I think this shows that there is a great deal of trust in the Red Cross. During the disaster which affected a number of countries, I was surprised that there are people who put cash, few $100,000 right into Red Cross because they show great trust in Singapore Red Cross. And it's important that unless we carry on our work, because with the highest standard of honesty, we may lose that trust. And I think this message must be brought down to everybody in Red Cross. I went to great extent to bring about corporate governance by reorganizing the board as an oversight, ensuring proper governance for the Red Cross, ensuring there's no hanky-panky conflict of interest. And I think this is part of my overall strategy to develop Singapore Red Cross as one of the most trusted charitable organizations in Singapore. And if we achieve that, we'll be able to be successful for the next 70 years. Thank you.